How can you tell if your personality is an authentic one or one based on survival? That's what the book recommendation today is going to be focused on, and it is absolutely incredible work called The Primal Wound. This goes into a lot of detail, and there's a lot of healing potential in a book like this, and I want to try to break it down as succinctly as I can, because this is going to appeal to a very particular type of person and introduce you to a very particular idea that you can use as a structure just to guide you through your life. So the idea when we talk about the primal wound is it's all to do with the empathic connection when we were growing up. So when we try to think about the primal wound itself, it's when that empathic connection breaks or there's a problem that occurs. So let's say between you as a baby and your mother who is raising you, if you do something as a baby or as a child in general and it's well received by a parent, then what's going to happen is there's going to be a mirroring that occurs where you do something, the mother realizes this and she gives you good positive feedback about what it is that you've done, in which case that's great, that's nice and straightforward. We just keep seeing more of that. If we do something and our caregiver doesn't like what it is that we have done, then again, it might be a bit uncomfortable in the short term, but we can learn something from that. I will learn, actually, doing these types of things, it doesn't really work well and it just doesn't happen to work well in the context that I have been born into. In my particular circumstances, when I do this thing, it isn't met well by my environment, so I'll stop doing this thing. In the first example, we started to do more of it. In the second example, we start to do less of it. But the problem is in this third area where there is no mirroring whatsoever. Where let's say as a child you do something and it just gets completely ignored. Nothing about that can tell you what you should or shouldn't be doing. And it breaks this empathic connection overall. Because no longer are you being encouraged to do something or discouraged to do something where there's in a healthy way an alternative that is suggested instead. There's just an ignorance, and that's very, very difficult when you're trying to grow up and learn who it is that you are, because a lot of our personality is going to be developed based on our understanding to those around us and to our environment and culture at large as well. So what's going to happen is, especially as a child, this is such a deep void, which is so difficult to be able to manage. It feels so uncomfortable that we'll start to fill it with absolutely anything just to start to get some attention. And if we don't necessarily get that attention, that's where things like addictions and coping mechanisms can start to come in as well. And that's going to have a huge impact on like the levels of trauma potentially, but also it might stilt or stuntify our potential for growth as well in the future. And that's what we're talking about when we try to talk about authenticity versus this survival-based mindset. Am I who I am because I want to be this person? Or am I who I am because I have to be this person to get my needs met and survive? And as a child, that's a very, very tough choice to be able to make, because one can lead towards survival and one won't. There's an annihilation. There's a real threat to our being in that sense. So without going into massive detail on all of this book is going to go through what happens when there is that break in the empathic connection, what happens as a result of it all, and how we can start to reverse that process as well. And this serves as a wonderful introduction to this idea of what's called transpersonal psychology, specifically psychosynthesis, where what we've got to do is we've got to think about it ourselves. Imagine we've got a diagram where at the top of this screen, imagine like an egg going down to the bottom of this screen here. If ourselves are in the center, let's say where my face is at this point in time, that's going to represent in the middle unconscious who I am, or who I could become, what is available to me as an idea. There might be some of these traits that I see within myself, some that I don't see within myself, but they exist potentially there. So let's say I value wisdom, I value intelligence, I value articulation. I'm aware of all those things, and to a certain extent, I'd like to think that I embody them. And if I don't, at least I can see them within other people. But it might be that there's certain values that I really hate within myself. Let's say I'm deep down a really vengeful person and I can't accept that anger. Well, in that case there, we've got to push that towards what's referred to in this case as the lower unconscious. We're repressing it or we're suppressing it. It doesn't mean it's gone. It just means it's outside of our conscious awareness, but it will still be pulling the strings behind the surface. There's a lot of links here to Carl Jung's shadow work. It's a very, very similar idea, where what we need to do is we need to realize that that quality that we've pushed down, actually, that still belongs to us. So if we can grapple with that, we can start to bring it back into our conscious awareness and start to deal with it, even if it is uncomfortable. And the exact opposite is true as well over here. So in another video in this series, I recommended this book, Fire in the Belly by Sam Keen. And when we talked about that video, we talked about the idea of mentoring and self-esteem and how we might put other people on a pedestal. Well, that would refer to up here as the higher unconscious. It's realizing that there are certain things that we've just not got the self-esteem to realize that we could become that type of person. Let's say you value yourself as someone who is intelligent, but you don't think you could ever sell out a stadium for people who would buy tickets to hear you speak. There's a certain block there where it's still in line with something you'd like to become and something you'd like to develop, but there's a real block in terms of not being able to believe that you could become that type of person. In that case there, what we need to do is we need to realize what it is that's repressed in the higher unconscious, our ideal self, our golden shadow, these might be words that you're more familiar with, and bringing that down into our conscious awareness. So when we start to think about this, when we start to think about the primal wound, it's realizing who we are on a conscious level and then trying to address the balance where we bring down the moments that we're like when we're in our best moments, our peak experiences, bringing them down into conscious awareness and trying to pretend like all these areas down here where we pretend that these aren't us. It's realizing they are us as well. And we're bringing those up to create a level playing field where that middle area then starts to expand, where I can start to introduce the ideas of who I am at my best, but also who I am at my worst, and realizing that they are both genuine parts of my personality, and that I don't need coping mechanisms or addictions to be able to deal with this part if I can actually grasp that. I've got nothing to defend against as long as I understand why that developed in the first place. So there's this real need for height psychology and depth psychology. I appreciate that in this video, out of all the videos that I'm recording, there's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of terminology in this, and I do apologize for the difficulty in the language of this, but it introduces so many wonderful ideas, and it forces you to look at your upbringing, and it starts to bring up the important material which we maybe quite often don't want to think about. We don't want to think too far into the future because maybe it gives us a certain amount of anxiety or fear. We don't want to go back into the past because, again, it brings a certain heaviness. But it's worth realizing that you are both of those people. Not only have you got the height and the depth, but you're also in the future and you're also in the past. You're this community which is happening at multiple angles. Across time, you are this community of individuals. And at any given point, you're this height and depth of an individual as well. And it's trying to understand that on this basis, you are both of these two things. You're all of these things. You're this very unique, complicated character, and it needs to be uncovered to be able to make sure that we've got this authentic personality rather than a survival-based one. To say, yes, I've considered everything. I've considered my past, my future, me at my best, me at my worst, and here is what I'm going to do overall. You can start to see already how a lot of this starts to link over in terms of our other videos, where in the previous one I talked about Viktor Frankl and Doctor and the Soul, and it's the same idea here as once we've figured this out, what do we do about it? How do we take this decisive attitude towards life, knowing where we've come from, knowing who we want to become as well? So to have this empathic resonance, once we've realized that as a child and how we relate to our caregivers, we can then start to relate to ourselves as well. There's this beautiful idea as well, going back to Winnicott, of the idea of a unifying center. It might be at first of all, there's a quality that I see within myself that I just can't accept. So I push it out there. Maybe I see it in other people, but not in myself. What I'm going to do overall, over time, is start to grab onto that and start to pull it back into myself until I can start to accept it within myself. So that idea might become an external unifying center. So it might be that I can't accept the anger within me at this point in time, but I can see anger with another person. The process, the healing process, is realizing that I've realized that anger with another person because it exists within me, and there's a resonance between me and this other person. So although I can't accept it in myself just yet, I can accept it, or I can notice it in another person. Then I can accept it in another person. Then I can feel like neutral towards it in another person. Then I can start to see how it might benefit me. And then from a unifying internal perspective, I can start to see how maybe there is actually a positive side towards anger, which I didn't quite realize beforehand. And it's trying to understand that process, not just about who I am in the future and who I am in the past and connecting those two. It's not just about the heights of who I am at my best and the depths of who I am at my worst, but it's realizing in all of this how I relate to another person and look at those qualities and then bring them further towards myself as well. As you can start to see probably with all of this, it's really, really hard to be able to describe a book like this because of the scope of it all. But that's exactly why the subtitle of this book is A Transpersonal View of Trauma, Addiction and Growth. This is quite a technical book, but I would highly, highly, highly recommend this. If it takes you a month or two to read it, that's fine, but put this into practice. The primal wound is just absolutely unbelievable, and we're going to go into a bit more detail in the next video and the next couple of videos of how to actually make that change as well. You can access this just on the right on the playlist, or just below, or just with any of the videos that are popping up. But as soon as you're ready to move on to the next video, I'm waiting for you just over there.